tell us a little bit about yourself. I'd love to kind of, before you get started into Jamstack, really hear about your role, what you're currently working on, and tell us kind of about your dev career as well, how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Well, currently I'm a developer advocate for StepZen. StepZen creates we have a way of consolidating all your backends and creating a single GraphQL API. So like it's very relevant to Jamstack stuff. GraphQL, in case anybody hasn't messed with it before, it's already integrated into a lot of Jamstack tools. And it's a way of kind of building APIs that different from, say, REST. So yeah, that's my current role. I've been a developer for, hopefully it doesn't look like it, but I mean, it's like been 23, 24 years. I've been working as a developer. I got my start. I did not do computer science. I was like a history and English major, and then I got out of school and I just started messing with Flash and other things at the time, like Flash and Director. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, you should take this course on Cold Fusion and I'll get you a job." And that's what I did. And he did get me a job. And the rest is kind of history. I moved, obviously not doing Cold Fusion and Flash anymore, although not so obvious, I guess. Cold Fusion's still around. Hey, Henri. But yeah, so I ended up kind of being a developer for a long time. And then I was doing conferences and writing articles and running user groups and all this stuff. And that led me into a role as a developer in developer relations back with Adobe many years ago. And it's kind of been where the kind of types of roles I've been in since then.
Awesome. I know that this role of developer advocacy and relations is not as known. If you don't mind telling us a little bit about what that means and what that entails.
Yeah, it's not the easiest thing to define because a lot of it's like depends on which company you're working at. Some of them are, there's a whole range of developer relations type roles. I've had a bunch of different ones. Like I've been in roles that were focused completely on content. So like I was publishing articles from the community and writing articles myself and helping to bring, get content from our internal teams. But a lot of it is about, there's kind of two sides to it, and whatever role you're in, part of it is the outreach to the community, trying to like both, be a good citizen in the developer community, but also, of course, help bring about awareness of the company's products. And then the other half is like gathering feedback that I bring back into the company. So it's like talking with people and understanding how they're using the products and helping to develop the products internally, like with that feedback. So there's kind of like those two channels there. That would be my best, very, very quick description of the role.
I'm not the best person because I understand that role really well. So I don't know if that description satisfies everyone. But before quickly we move on to Jamstack, I'd love your opinion about how, as someone who's trying to break into the industry, what can you do as an advocate for, like, what are some of the things that a new developer could do so that they're sort of advocating for their tech skills and standing out from the crowd as well?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think one of the things that I encourage is being involved in communities like this, but also like say sites like dev.to and other kinds of welcoming communities that have large groups of developers. I mean, the thing that got me, kind of was a big difference in my career was getting involved in the community, both participating in events, just going to like my local meetups. It's a little bit different now that there's no in-person meetups, hopefully soon. But that was always a big thing for me. But also just, I started blogging, honestly, like this was many, many years ago. And I started blogging, it was mostly me taking notes for myself. Like I was sharing stuff like, I'll refer to this later. And then I was shocked to find out people were reading it. And it kind of took off from there. I think there's lots of opportunities for developers nowadays, particularly even like junior developers or people trying to break into development, to like communities like dev.to that I mentioned. Kind of welcome you to go share your experiences and share while you're learning, and encourage people to be active that way. And I think you'll gain a lot from that, both in terms of what you learn sharing, in terms of what you learn from people giving you feedback, and in terms of building connections that can help your career.
That's great advice. It's also a great journaling tool as well, of just
Yep.
seeing your progression as you grow. But yeah, that's for me. I'm gonna let you take it over and tell us more about the Jamstack.
Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen, and then I'm gonna click present, and I'm assuming you see my slide. We're good? Yeah, you see the slides? Okay. All right, so so we're going to talk about introduction to Jamstack. I already gave you a little bit about me, but this is just kind of like give you a little bit of background as well on, like I already told you about my job as a developer advocate at StepZen. I also run a site, CFE.dev, which if you like Mintbean, you might also like my site. I've run a lot of similar types of meetups and stuff, but different, but similar. So I love what Mintbean is doing. So I think we kind of both headed in similar directions there. Been working with Jamstack tools since 2013. They weren't called Jamstack back then. We just called them like static site generators, flat out, that like we're building static sites. But I got an early start with a tool called Jekyll back in 2013. So I've been doing this, you know, in Jamstack history terms, a long time, because Jamstack hasn't been around that long. And I have done a lot. So like just kind of, you know, what gives me any authority to talk on this topic? I've done a lot about it. I wrote a report for Riley in 2015 on static site generators. I did a book with my friend Raymond Camden working with static sites in 2017. And we've got currently the Jamstack book, which is writing for Manning, also with Ray Camden, is coming soon, but it is available in early access. And I think about 2/3 of the book is already out, that you can get early access. So if you're curious about what I told you about earlier about StepZen, there's the URL to StepZen.com. You can /request invite to request an invite to try it out. And this is like, if you're interested in the Jamstack book, particularly if like as a follow-up to this presentation, you can get the Manning Early Access Program, which is what MEEP means. You can get access to the book and chapters as they're released. Okay, so enough intro. So what is the Jamstack? And I'm going to preface this presentation by telling you a lot of this is going to be me talking a lot of theory about Jamstack and less code about Jamstack. And I'll explain to you why. Because Jamstack is basically something you can enter through a number of different ways, and we'll get to why in a moment. But understanding what the Jamstack is and all the different options available to you is critical to me to choosing how you'd get started. So if I could teach you one particular Jamstack technology, and you might say that that's my path, but I don't like to do it that way, because one of the things I love about the Jamstack is that there are lots and lots of options. So I'm going to tell you what the Jamstack is, but this is like very much my view of what the Jamstack is. I think a lot of people share it, but there are people who disagree with some of the things I might tell you. I won't say that they're wrong. I just will imply it. Just haha. But this is, just keeping that in mind. There are people who kind of disagree with some of what I'm going to tell you, but anyway. Oh, I forgot this was even animated. Yeah, fun. All right, so here's the thing. Normally, you'll hear somebody introduce you to the Jamstack, and they'll talk about the jam, and the JAM, and what that stands for, and all that stuff. Forget about it. Forget it. It doesn't mean, it's not important. It's not really relevant anymore. I used to talk that way and have found that it actually adds to people's confusion about what the Jamstack is, because if you say, okay, Jamstack is JavaScript, APIs, and markup, you're like, well, I'm doing that already. So I'm doing Jamstack. Everything is Jamstack. Nothing is Jamstack. It's meaningless. every site at some level includes JavaScript APIs and markup, right? So that doesn't mean every site is Jamstack. So what is it that makes Jamstack different? So this is how I define the Jamstack. Jamstack is a methodology, or you could say an architecture that emphasizes static first. And we'll talk about what each of these items means in a moment, but I'll just kind of cover them here first. It involves a static site generator. Some people disagree with me on, this is kind of one of those ones that I think people disagree on. To me, it always involves a static site generator. Yes, you can write straight files, but there's no dynamic aspect to that. Like if you're just writing files in straight HTML, so the static site generator adds part of the dynamic aspect of the builds of Jamstack, whereas just writing straight files isn't really doing that. It's deployed to a CDN, and that is critical in a number of ways, and we'll kind of talk about why. It leverages APIs at build time, runtime, or both for creating dynamic content. And we'll kind of discuss what that means as well. So there are some key things in that line. The build time, runtime, or both is kind of one of the confusing things about Jamstack, and we'll talk about why. I'm gonna move this. Hold on. It's just gonna move this little thing out of the way. Because come on, mouse. Where's my mouse? Okay, forget it. The little Zoom thing is covering my presentation. So, okay, so we're going to talk about first this what does it mean by a methodology or architecture that emphasizes static first? Okay, so static first, and notice I'm not just saying static. Static first, like the assets and content are pre-rendered wherever possible, right? So that means that like I'm using the static site generators to pre-render content. So if I have like a CMS that's hooked up, I will render that at build time. So content from like local files, I might have markdown files or JSON or YAML files that render data that's part of the build, but I also might pull in APIs at build time that creates, that pulls in content. And that's all rendered at build time. That content can be enhanced at runtime with JavaScript and APIs. So like, not everything has to be done at build time. That's kind of the difference between a plain old static site and a Jamstack site is we are trying to enhance that with JavaScript and APIs. And the use of server-side rendering, which is technically possible, but generally it's kind of like a last resort. So there are some tools like Next.js, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that actually do allow you to do server-side rendering. And you can actually mix and match server-side rendering with pre-rendered assets. And it's really kind of cool. And it kind of blurs the line of what's Jamstack into this kind of hybrid. That's why I say static first and not static only, because there are cases where you might want to have a particular route that it makes sense to have that route server rendered, but everything else could be statically pre-rendered. So that's kind of where that concept comes from. So let's talk next about involves static site generator. So what is a static site generator? Basically, a static site generator takes like a bunch of files like Markdown and YAML and Sass and maybe TypeScript and basically pulls that all together and spits out HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Very, very simple concept in general, but static site generators have become incredibly complex tools. Some of them doing quite a lot more. So they like if you were using these tools back in like 2013 when I started with Jekyll, this is basically the extent of what it did. It just took a bunch of static files. Like I could have a bunch of markdown files and it would combine those with templates that I built, like say in Liquid, and then combine that with, and render that out to HTML. And then I would deploy that HTML. Now these tools do a lot of different things. Like they have asset management built in. They have ways of pulling external APIs built in. They have a whole process for building and different types of tools. And you can configure them with Webpack, and you can do. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things built into these tools now. But at their core, they still are at the core, it's still generating static assets from a bunch of files or APIs. In that case, you could pull in an API and it would pull that content in, right? So once you start thinking about static site generators, there's kind of like two groups of them in my mind, which is traditional static site generators, which are really kind of more like what we used to talk about with like that used to be the extent of static site generators, like your Jekylls, your Hugos. A more kind of modern and more recent one is 11D. That's JavaScript based. It has a lot of cool things that it brings in that are similar, and say, to the JavaScript framework based static site generators, but it's still kind of focused solely on creating that, it gives you the build process and how to generate files and how to pull in different types of content, but it doesn't prescribe the front end. And that's the kind of the key distinction here. It's not telling you what front end you need to use. Whereas the JavaScript framework-based static site generators, which may be ones that you've heard of because they're quite popular, like Gatsby, Next.js, or Nuxt.js, they rely on a JavaScript framework. So like Gatsby and Next are React, Nuxt is Vue. There's also one for Angular called Scully. And there's other ones also like that use different frameworks. You build the site using that framework. So all the static assets that are generated are actually built using the framework as well. But then the front end requires the framework. So your front end is built in React or built in Vue or built in Angular. So it's very prescriptive about that front end. So I like to kind of remind people in many ways, because I think there's been a lot of confusion about Jamstack being a JavaScript framework-based solution. That is not the case. You don't have to use a JavaScript framework if you don't want to. I do both. I switch back and forth. I do a lot of work with Hugo, but I also do a lot of work with Next.js. And it really depends on what I'm building, and what a lot of it has to do with how complex your user interface interactions, how you want them to be. If in the traditional SSG, you're going to end up building a lot of that yourself. You could do it with straight JavaScript. You can still pull in a framework if you want to. There's nothing saying you can't. With the JavaScript framework-based static site generators, you're gonna have to use the framework that they prescribe, and they often have a way of doing things that you have to follow, right? So there's a lot of advice I can give you about like choosing which static site generator. I actually wrote a whole article, so it's easier just to kind of send you there. This is on Snipcart's blog. It's choose the best static site generator. For 2021, it's kind of like a recent look at which are the top static site generators, and I try and give you some advice on which ones to choose. I don't like to tell you like one is necessarily better than the other. As I said, one of the things I love about Jamstack is that there are a ton of options, and you just choose what works best for you, what fits your workflow. So like, for instance, if you don't even like JavaScript at all, you can use tools like Go, like Hugo, which is built on Go, or like Jekyll, which is built on Ruby, or like, Pelican, which is built on Python. Basically there's a static site generator for whatever language you prefer. So this is not like just a JavaScript thing. Obviously your front end will use JavaScript, but that's a whole other story. There's, I think, 360 options for static site generators last I checked. They're not all great options, but there are probably a good, 20, 30 options that are actively used, have good communities. So whatever language you prefer, you could find a tool that uses that language. It's not even always important what language, like I do a lot of Jekyll and I don't know Ruby. So it's not always like critically important that you choose a static site generator that matches the language that you're interested in. So let's move on to is deployed to a CDN. So what does that mean? So I'm sure if you've used CDNs on some level, like, you're including like, say, a JavaScript library on the front end that is on a CDN, or maybe your work, at work, your sites you're building are deployed to some kind of CDN to speed up their, the access for people. So it's deployed across CDNs all across the world. So that, in this case, the CDN is important. It's kind of where Jamstack gets some of the key benefits. You hear people talk about the speed and the security and the scaling of Jamstack, and a lot of that is tied to deploying to a CDN. So these are static assets. They're deployed to like global CDNs, usually with any of the hosts that you can choose with for Jamstack. Typically will deploy these across a global network of CDNs. So you get like people can get the content quickly because it's delivering it from one that's close to them. But the other key thing is there's no web application server. We're not deploying to a web server. This is just basically serving up static assets. So that not only helps with the speed in that serving static assets is going to be very fast by default, but it helps with the security because there is no web server to compromise or anything like that. So, you know, as somebody who, for instance, came from a background in things like Cold Fusion, I did some PHP and other stuff. I mean, keeping that web server up to date, that web application server up to date was often a key security issue. Here, you don't have that issue. It's not to say that Jamstack sites there aren't ways you could compromise a Jamstack site. There's always, anything you build is going to be a way, but Jamstack sites have a level of security. Very few you know, opportunities are available to hack into it because there is no web server, there is no web application server. And CDNs are basically built to scale. That's kind of their entire job. So like, you know, if you've ever built a WordPress site, I've done a ton of them in the past. I do still think WordPress is a great tool, but I know, like, I used to run a site, and as soon as like something I posted got popular, that site, boom, it was down. You know, couldn't connect to the database, or you know, whatever. It started crawling. That's not an issue here. We are serving static assets, and CDNs are built to scale, so this is going to scale up very quickly as your site traffic improves. So finally, and talk about the last item here. Leverages APIs at build time, runtime, and you know, for dynamic stuff. So this, to me, this is the key thing. This is what differentiates a static site from a Jamstack site. This is where Jamstack superpowers come in. So the APIs and JavaScript that calls these APIs on the front end, or the tooling to call them on the build time, is what turns your static site into a Jamstack site. Because to me, it's like you can take these tools. You could just write markdown content and spit yourself out a blog. And yeah, that's cool. And actually, their tools are really, really fantastic for doing that. You know, you could, I kind of say, like, that's really just the static site, though. Is it really Jamstack? If you're not doing anything beyond that, you're really just kind of compiling a bunch of files into static assets that you can deploy. Like I said, it's great. I do a lot of that myself, so I'm not dissing it. I'm just saying, like, the big thing about what makes Jamstack powerful is the use of APIs and JavaScript to turn that site into something more dynamic. So this is where you get into one of these kind of difficulties I think people coming to Jamstack suffer, which is that you have to start thinking in Jamstack. I was so used to building sites where, like, I never really had to think about when things got built, right? So the way it worked was somebody sent a request for a page. That page sent the request got sent to the web server. That page got rendered. All the content got rendered, sent back to the user, and that was it, right? There was only that process going on there. Everything was rendered at runtime. But in Jamstack, it can be confusing because you have the kind of build time and runtime. So some of the things, like if I request a page full of content that may be coming from a headless CMS, for instance, or pulling in data APIs or asset management, things like that, those might actually get pre-built, pre-rendered at build time. So I have to kind of start thinking about my content differently, and about my site a little bit differently. What pieces can get built at build time, and what pieces need to come in at runtime. So, like, if I need to add things like user authentication or like user preferences or any kind of client-side functionality, like as an example, a simple example that's common is search I can't pre-render search. I need to render search at runtime. So I can use tools like Algolia or whatever to do that, but it has to happen at runtime. So that's all going to happen via calls from JavaScript to an API. Whereas at build time, if I'm going to pull in content from a headless CMS, I can pre-render that. That may happen via JavaScript. That may happen via something else, some other tool that I like if I'm in Jekyll, I may use Ruby to do that, or if I'm in Hugo, I might use Go to do that and things like that. So it doesn't have to happen via JavaScript, but I would pull in those at build time, right? So it's kind of, you have to adjust your thinking when you start trying to build Jamstack sites, and think about them a little bit differently than just the typical request response way of kind of, everything was done at runtime. Now you have to, what content can I pre-render? What content do I have to do at runtime? So I think that kind of covers the theory. So let's see where we're going to begin. I'm going to show you. As I mentioned, there's a lot of tools. So the key, one of the things here is I'm going to show you two, and I'm just going to kind of run through how you get started, like just to show you how this works. And I'm going to show you two different examples, one being a traditional static site generator, and then one being a JavaScript framework-based static site generator. And just to kind of give you a sense of the flavor. The thing is, there's a lot, as you might have understood from seeing some of the slides, is there's a lot more involved. Like all I'm doing right now is just showing you basically the static site generator. I can't, it's going to take a lot to teach you, like, okay, well now how do I integrate a headless CMS? And now how do I call, Algolia to get search on the client, and how do I, so all of those, how do I integrate Auth0 or something like that for authentication? All of those are important things to building a real site. And this is where I thought that all that theory, well, it's a lot of slides, is really important, because that can help you decide like how you want to get started, because there are so many options available to you that you can kind of pick and choose the way you want to go. Since it is a methodology, it's not a stack in the traditional sense that like it's prescriptive about the technologies you use. So let's look at a couple here. So I'm going to look at first I'm going to look at Hugo. So I've kind of talked a little bit about Hugo before. It's more like the traditional static site generator that I've been mentioning. It's built in Go. So this is one of kind of the Hugo superpower, is it's like blazing fast. So I often recommend it, in particular if you have a big site that has a lot of statically generated content. Hugo can be an excellent solution. So like an example I often think of is like documentation sites often have a lot of pages, and most of those pages are going to be pre-rendered rather than built on client at runtime. So using something like Hugo can make your builds really, really fast, because some of the weaknesses of some of the JavaScript framework-based tools is that the build process can be a little bit slow. So it uses the Go templating language. So this is kind of like one of the key things when you're getting started with a static site generator, is you're going to spend a lot of time building templates, use in their whatever templating language. Some of them support multiple templating languages, and I think there are ways to get other templating languages into Hugo, but by default it uses the Go templating language. And the one thing I find for people who don't like Hugo is that's often where they struggle. It's got a bit of a quirky syntax, and it's got a bit of a learning curve. I really like it because I find it very flexible. I can do just about anything I want using it. But it is a little bit tougher than, say, Liquid, which is what Jekyll uses by default. It's actually really, really easy. So I am going to hop out of slides here, and I'm going to go to my command line. Pull up my nose here. So, all right. So the way Hugo is a little bit different. Actually, let me pull up the site here. I'll show you. So you find out about Hugo, go hugo.io. If you go to the quick start, you'll see like one of the things that's a little bit different about Hugo is that it's actually a binary. It's not like some of the other tools. You got to you got it installed differently. Hugo's just like, I can actually download the binary and put it, as long as I put in my path, I can call it. But the easiest way to install it is via Homebrew, which is how I manage it as well. So I already have it installed. Let me increase the size of this so you can see it a little better. And the way you create a new site is Hugo new site. And then you just give it like a folder name. So I'm going to call mine Mintbean Hugo. All right. All right. So it gives you a little bit of instructions on how to use it. But we're just going to go ahead and cd into the, and then I'm going to actually go ahead and just open up code. So you can see this because I want to show you what the structure of a Hugo site looks like. So one of the things about Hugo that's also causes it to have a little bit of a learning curve is if I pre-generate a Jekyll site, it's going to basically already come with some content and things like that. And I could just run it and it's going to do something. If I tried to run the Hugo site right now, you're going to see a blank page because nothing is here. Just essentially this is the folder structure as well as the configuration file, which basically has very little in it at this point in time. So as you can see, these are all like empty. It's other than this Archetypes one. So it's just giving you kind of the core structure, and then you got to fill it in with the stuff you need. So just kind of go over what goes where to give you basic sense. Obviously, themes is themes. You don't have to use themes. You can actually create your layouts via the Go templating language in this layouts folder, but they do have a ton of themes. We'll actually, I think it's themes.gohugo.io. You can see there's like a ton of different ones. We're going to use one really quickly here, but there's a lot of them here to choose from, a lot of pre-built themes, mostly from the community that you can choose from. So that's where these would be installed. Static is, so with any static site generator, there's a folder that you basically put your static assets that need to be brought into the build. So like, let's say if I'm going to have images that I'm not going to use, Hugo has asset management built in, but if I don't need asset management on those images, for instance, or I have like raw CSS or JavaScript files that I want to bring in, I would put those in this static folder. And then those would be brought in to the build when I do run my build. Again, layouts is where you put your layouts. If you have a theme installed, layouts is also where you'd override existing layouts that are in that theme if you want to customize them. Data, so almost every static site generator has this concept of data, which is like file-based data that I can use throughout the site. So for instance, if I wanted to include a YAML or a JSON file and then be able to use that data throughout the site, I'd throw that in Hugo, I'd throw that in this data folder. Content is where I'd put, in the case of Hugo, content is where I'm going to put markdown. So this is basically where all my markdown, or even it could be HTML too, but usually this is where you throw markdown files. And all of that content will then be pulled in to kind of applied to a layout, depending on how you specify that and generate. So like if I had a file in here about.md, that would create a page that would be /about.html or just /about. Actually, so that's where you put that. Archetypes are kind of like your different types of pages. It's a concept that is, I actually don't use archetypes much in Hugo, so I'm not the best to explain them. And I've done a ton of Hugo development. I've rarely used them, so I will leave that one out for now. All right, so we're going to go ahead and I'm going to install one of those themes. Because the theme, is installed in this case as a Git sub module, I need to just git init this, and then I'm gonna let me copy this URL here. I'm gonna Git sub module, this Anatole theme. So we'll see like that it now added this theme here into my themes folder. They even give you a full example site here. We're actually going to get that running real quick. Again, I am not gonna kind of go through too much more than that. I just want to kind of show you how this all works a little bit, just to kind of give you a general sense. One of the things is we need, so when you have a theme, they often come with a bunch of configuration options that are, because you can extend the Hugo configuration however you want. And generally themes will come with a bunch of pre-configured like configuration options. So you can see that this one includes a ton. I'm not going to go through what they all are, but I do need them to make this run. So I'm just going to copy them into my own here and save it. As I mentioned before, the content, this is where your markdown files are. This is how you manage your content on the site if you're just using file-based content. Again, you'll want to use APIs and headless CMS and stuff like that. But if you're just doing markdown content, which your site probably will include some of it at some level, you'd want to include these, you'd have content in markdown in this folder. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just copy all these. I'm just going to cheat and just paste them in here. So we got them because I just want to get my site running. And then finally, I need, again, those static assets that need to be part of the build. Like in this case, the favicons and the images that are going to be part of the build. I need those. I'm just going to dump those in my static folder here. All right. So now I should be able to go. Okay. So typically for Hugo, it would be to run the local server. It's Hugo serve. And then it's localhost. Wait, remind me what localhost 1212. I think in Hugo it is, right? 1313. I don't know why I said 1212. Localhost 1313. So this is where Hugo runs your local web server. So you can, what you'd be able to do now is if I make changes and stuff, those will automatically be reflected. So this is how I work on the site. So at this point, I've got kind of my core files in there. And if I want to start customizing look and feel and things like that, I can do all that. It's going to live reload all the content changes that I make, rebuild anything as I go along. And then when I'm all done, at that point, I would run like Hugo build, and I'd build out the HTML and deploy that somehow. Or I could push this to something like, like Netlify or Versal or one of the many hosts that are out there for Jamstack content. And they would actually run the build for me, which is the way better process. You can just upload the static files, but that just, that process can kind of breaks down pretty quickly. What you want to do is work with somewhere where you can actually push up the core, the basic Hugo files or whatever static site generator you use, and then the build will run as soon as you check in any changes to GitHub or something like that. That is the preferable way to work with Jamstack. It's way easier. Back in the day when I started, the only available means was via FTP, and let me tell you, it was a pain in the butt. So that's all I'm really going to show you about Hugo. Again, one of the key things I want to point out about it, though, is that by default, I'm really just working with static files here that are in the content folder. A lot of the traditional static site generators, that's kind of where what they're built for at their core. But I can easily figure out how to pull in APIs like a headless CMS or like a Cloud Canary for images and things like that if I want to do that at build time. But kind of they come out of the box built for Markdown and YAML and that kind of content. Okay, so we're going to close this up. All right. And then I'm going to kind of CD out of here. We're going to look next at next. We're going to look at next. So Next.js is a little bit different. Next.js actually has been around for quite a while. It is a React framework, as the site says here. The thing is, Next.js was not necessarily like, it always could do some level of static sites, but it kind of was optimized as like basically a node-based React framework. So you'd have the front end and the back end are all done in React. And it's evolved to be a really excellent tool for building Jamstack sites. So one of the things there are a lot of options if you're a React developer and you want to use React for your tooling here. Some of the things that are different about Next.js There isn't, like, say on Gatsby, there's no plugin ecosystem per se. So that's makes it a little bit harder. Gatsby can be a little bit easier to get started, but Next.js has a ton of really cool features. As I mentioned before, it can do both server-side rendering and static pre-rendering. You can even combine those two. It makes it really, really easy to make routes for React. So that's kind of one of the things. It's like it doesn't require a ton of configuration at the start. It's pretty easy to learn and get started with. I really enjoy it, but there are a bunch of other options. If you're into React, I mean, you might check out Gatsby as well. It's a good one to get started. But I'm gonna show you next. One other thing to point out, it's made by Vercel, which is one of the hosting options like Netlify. So they create this framework, but it is fully open source. So to create a Next.js app, it's a little bit different. There is no install process or anything like that. I actually run npx, which, if you, or you can run yarn. npx is a way of like just running node modules without installing them. So I run npx create next app. You can just do that. If I just did npx create next app, it would give me kind of a basic Next.js application, kind of like what we did for Hugo, except it will have a single page. So I could actually run it. But one of the awesome things about Next, and so you see I have like -- example blog starter. So one of the awesome things about Next, and let's go to their GitHub page. I'm going to show you this so you can understand, is they have a bunch of these examples. So there's, I mean, as you can see, there are a lot here. So pretty much anything you want to be able to connect to. It doesn't have the plugin ecosystem, but it's probably got an example here that you can use as a starting point for your project. So it just keeps going. Like a lot of them are like, with whatever. So like if you were using Redis, you could use, with Redis, or if you just wanted to kind of explore this and see what it would take to connect Redis or connect Storybook or whatever, you can kind of come here and see that. I often start with one of these. Like I use Tailwind on a lot of my projects, so I've used this with Tailwind CSS one quite a bit, and it's great, just simple starting point so you can skip some of the initial integration pieces. So we are going to use, there are a few blog examples, and I'm only using blog because it's just easy to understand. That's not necessarily the greatest. I don't want you to think Jamstack is basically a solution for building blogs. It's way more than that. But blog's kind of a simple example, easy way to start. So there's blog starter, there's blog, and there's blog starter TypeScript. I'm going to use this blog starter one because this blog one does a little bit different. It's all MDX, and that's not what I'm looking for right now. So I'm just going to use blog starter, and I just tell it what folder I want created. So we're going to call this one Mintbean next, and then it's going to run through and it's going to install all the packages for me that's required. As is usual for any kind of JavaScript based tooling, it's only like about 10 billion node packages that it's just installed there for me to get this to run. So we're going to go cd Mintbean next. Then I'm going to, before I run it, I'm just going to go show it to you in code. So this is the structure of kind of a typical, I guess, Next.js site. There's so many different things of it, like ways you can do Next.js here. So I'll kind of cover what each of these pieces are really quickly. Like the other one, static. If you remember in Hugo, we talked about the static folder. In Next.js, it's called public. So this is where I put like things like assets and things that I want pulled into the build. Okay. Everything else here, the components folder is where I create my React components. So these would be things that I want included in my pages, and I'll tell you what pages are in a moment. So components are like, any kind of React components that I might import into my project. So like here, they've got the footer for the site that I want to pull in as a component rather than have it built into the page, so I can use it on multiple pages and stuff like that. This post folder is just part of the blog starter. This is not, there is no requirement that you use a underscore post folder for content. So this, in this case, that's where they're putting their markdown content. I often put mine in a /content folder. There's no requirement on how you do anything like that if you're using markdown content. The thing I would point out, then the reason I pulled in this example is because by default, Next.js does not know anything about markdown. If you want to import markdown, you need to handle that. You're going to need to code it. So that's why, like, if you use this blog starter, it's got that kind of stuff built in. Pages, though, is an important part of a Next.js project. Pages is like basically everything in Pages is a route here. Okay. So like if I have index.js would be my home page, but post slash, and this is a special kind of a route, a dynamic route in Next.js. So post / slug would be, slug is dynamic. Slug is based on whatever the like this, for instance, hello world would be post / hello world. So it fills that in for you dynamically. So this is how you kind of define where the different pages are in your Next.js app. Each of these is a route. There are, like, again, special routes like this. You can even put those brackets on a folder, and Next.js will dynamically populate that folder. So that's kind of like, it's got really, really cool shortcuts. That's partly why it's become so popular as a React framework, because it handles a lot of that messy stuff for you. You don't have to do it. So you can see one of the key things here is that when you're building Jamstack sites with Next.js, you're going to use a lot of this get static paths, and then there's another method called get static props. Get static paths defines the paths that need to be created. So like in this case, since this is creating dynamically, get static paths is going to generate what paths do I need to create for this site. So this is looping through all the slugs that are in this content folder and creating those paths. And then you have get static props, which is basically any properties that you need to pass to your page here at build time. And that's kind of a key distinction because Next.js has both server side and like server side rendering and pre-rendering. So like it has get static props and it has get server props. So obviously, if you're building a Jamstack site, you're not using get server props. You're going to have to use get static props. And Next.js is smart enough to kind of say like, oh, this page only uses static props, so I can actually pre-render this page, and it will do that. Okay. So let's go ahead, and I think that's basically everything that you really need to know about like the basic setup of a Next.js project. So we're going to go yarn dev, which will run it, just kind of show you running. It's got to run through a whole build process here. As I said, the thing about Hugo was like that. Next.js takes a little bit longer. Okay, but it is actually running already. So we can go to localhost 3000. We should see the page. Again, this is just a simple example that's pre-built, that's building in, that's pulling in markdown content. So you can see, as you saw, like posts, so that dynamic routing.md would be turned into post / dynamic routing as a path. So it's doing that automatically. Again, this is just pulling in markdown content. One of the nice things about, say, Next.js or other JavaScript-based static site generators is I can really, really easily pull in dynamic content from APIs. So for instance, I just do a fetch from this get static props and pull in any API I want to, and then populate the data. And all that's done at build time. So it makes it really, really easy to do that, particularly if you already know JavaScript. It's really easy to call any API and get that content. In this case, we're just calling markdown content just to make it easy, but that's how that works. So I'm going to go back to my slides here because, hold on, where are my slides? Oh, that's right. I did these in Keynote, which I'm not used to. Okay, so I already kind of gave you the rundown of Next.js React-based static site generator. So the learning curve can be steep. If you aren't already familiar with React, it supports static site generation, pre-rendering, it supports server-side rendering, and even hybrids. You can do, I could have some paths rendered at build time and some paths rendered server-side. That's even supported on on things. It's obviously supported on Vercel. But like even places like Netlify that are traditionally just static site, it's just not static site, just Jamstack site with no server-side rendering, actually do support that server-side rendering in Next.js. It's, just kind of give you quick how they do that. Basically, Next.js, when you create the server-side rendering, it's just creating like serverless functions that feed, populate that. So all like, for instance, Netlify does is they use Netlify functions, and they just take all of your server-side rendered pages and they create like a Netlify function for those to serve up the content via node. So that's how Next.js works anyway. So it's not really a hack or anything. That's just kind of how they fit it into their build process. Obviously, Vercel, being the creators of Next.js, have kind of out of the box do whatever Next.js can do is supported on Vercel. So hopefully this gives you a good general overview of what the Jamstack is, how you might get started. I've only showed you a couple examples, but I'd say, like, where would you go from this point? I suggest, there are a ton of static site generators. You can reference that post that I linked to earlier, and I'll share the slides. I don't know how Mintbean gets those out to you, but I will share the slides so you can get access to those links and stuff like that. But try out different static site generators, and as you can see, you could get started in just a matter of minutes and experiment and see how you like. If you like how they feel, if you like how the code works in that, if the learning curve doesn't feel too steep. So there's lots of examples, like Next.js has a ton of those examples, but also, like, if you are interested in using any of the tools, like if you have a static, a headless CMS or a headless e-commerce tool that you want to use, most of them have like pre-built examples using different ones of these tools. So go ahead and explore those. Another one that, another service I recommend for people who want to explore is a site, stackbit.com. They basically, you would choose your static site generator, you choose your headless CMS, and you basically, it'll put everything together for you and deploy it. And then you can pull the code because it's just pushed to your GitHub repository. And so it's a good way to like explore how different integrations work and even see how different static site generators work, because they have a number of the popular ones already built in. So and you choose a theme. So like you get everything kind of out of the box. They obviously do have other services, but that, even if you're just trying to experiment, it's a great way to get started. And I would say, like, go ahead and try different ones and just deploy them. Most of these tools like Vercel and Netlify and Render and all the different other ones that are out there, Azure Static page websites or Azure Static sites, they all have a very generous free level. So you could just deploy them and experiment and try different ones. And I would say, once you get past that whole, like, here, I built a static site with these tools and deployed it to one of these deployment options, then you can start to begin to experiment more with the API integration, both at build time and runtime, because that's, adding that in at first to me is like an extra complication. You got to get comfortable with the workflow, and then you start kind of extending it with, like, now I want to pull in, different other tools and see how they work, and do that once you get past that workflow process. That's my recommendation. So I don't know, if we have time for questions, but I'm available for questions. If you just want to contact me afterwards, you can reach out to Brian at StepZen.com or at RemoteSynth to contact me. Other than that, I've got no more slides, so I'm going to go ahead and escape out of here and stop sharing. And Navi, do we have time for questions? Or looks like there were some in the chat.
Yeah, there are some in the chat. I wanted to know if you have time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. That was awesome, by the way. I think there's so much to learn when it comes to the Jamstack, and I think you broke it down phenomenally. And I
Thanks.
think there's lots of different ways to go, and hopefully maybe have you come back and take a deeper dive into it. But I'd let you answer some questions in the chat.
Okay, I'm going to start at the end here and go work my way back. So, how does Jamstack handle a failure on the part of an API being called on the front end? Okay, so obviously, on the one of the things I didn't mention, and thanks, Erica. One of the things I didn't mention is that if something goes wrong at that build time, basically your site never fully deploys and the site's never down. So like one thing I should have mentioned is that when you deploy a site, like basically there's this what do they call it? Atomic deploys. If any part of that fails, the site just doesn't get deployed. But at no point during that is your site down. Okay. Now, when you're talking about on the client side, there's no particular Jamstacky way to handle like an API failure, right? Like that's kind of up to you. The same way you'd handle it on any website that you're calling via JavaScript, you'd handle on a Jamstack website. That part's no different because it's really however you code your front end. So you know if you're writing in React and you got your error handlers and blah blah blah, that's how you do it. The same way you do it on any site. There's no prescriptive Jamstack way to handle that. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to go back to Alan. He asks, I have a question related to security. Wouldn't a private API key be exposed in Jamstack style site? What are some ways to securely call API services in Jamstack? Okay, yes. If you could be exposing like an API key, there are multiple ways of handling this. So like for instance, a lot of times what you end up doing, if you have a key you need to secure, that you actually call a serverless function like in Netlify, I'd call a Netlify function. And the Netlify function basically exposes very limited access to that API. And it has the API key there. And that's never part of my like build. It's not exposed in my JavaScript. It's only part of that serverless function. Obviously, that serverless function has a public URL. I could call that function. There are different ways you can code around that to handle, like if you want, depending on how secure you need it to be. In most cases, like I'm calling something where I'm only exposing the piece that I need for my site. So it's kind of, it's like protected in the sense that you could call it, but you could say only get content for my site or things like that. If it needs more protection, a colleague of mine wrote on the StepZen.com blog, wrote a post about different methods to add additional security, like, make sure that it's only coming from this, URL and, whitelisting URLs and checking that, it's using the right method and the, different other ways to add extra protection to that serverless function. But your key, the point is the key is not exposed. In a tool like Next.js, there's even a way they have a basically a built-in route for that's in Pages. I think it's Pages/API that basically creates those serverless functions for you. So you could even just write that in there, and then you store your secure keys in a .env file, and basically that gets pulled in during the build process. But because that /API route is only deployed as functions, like that never gets into the build that's publicly available, like that people can pull the code for. I hope that makes sense. It is an important question, but it's, if you're calling anything, it's kind of the same thing. There's when you get to the front end, it's important to remember there's nothing different about a Jamstack application on the front end than there is any other website. So if I was just building with React, I'm going to face the same problems if I'm calling an API as I do in a Jamstack site, whether I'm using React or not, right? Like those keys might be exposed if I put them in my JavaScript. So I'm going to have to find ways to get around that by, in the case of like React, I might call that server side. In this case, server side is usually a serverless function. So, I'm going back. Let's see. Okay, got one more question. Looks like here. I'm not seeing any others. So, is it beginner friendly? What pre-knowledge is required? Yes, I think it is beginner friendly. But here's my recommendation. It depends on what kind of beginner you are, right? If you're somebody who already comes in with some level of web development experience and you've already been toying with some of these frameworks like React or Vue, then maybe starting with something like a Gatsby or a Nuxt might not be not be too much of a heavy lift. But if you're relatively new to web development, it is going to be a struggle. I think adding in the concepts of a whole framework, JavaScript framework, on top of the concepts that you're already dealing with like learning Jamstack way of building things, is going to be a lot. So if you're relatively new, relatively new developer, I would suggest starting with something like a Jekyll, or maybe Hugo. Or if you're really interested in JavaScript, start with maybe 11D, because all of those are a little bit simpler to get over. You're not going to add in the JavaScript framework overhead, learning overhead to that. Let's see, any other? All right. So recommended places for starting resource guide. There is a site. I'm going to post the URL here. Let me pull it up. There's Jamstack.org. I'm not going to put that because I think you can pretty much find that yourself. I think Jamstack.org though is very useful. It's got a lot of information. Another place that has a bunch of links that I find have been useful in the past is Jamstack.wtf. That has a lot of information about getting started. Obviously, you can buy my book. That'd be cool too. We cover a lot of these different things. So, I cover like building an e-commerce site in Next.js, building a documentation site in Hugo. We cover 11D and Jekyll and all that stuff. But yeah, those are kind of good places to get going. The other thing I'd recommend is there's on jamstack.org, there's a link to their Slack community, which has been very helpful as well. And I would say if you want to find people to connect with and learn more about it, join their Jamstack community. So that's just jamstack.org, and then look up the community tab and it has the link to their Slack. Yeah, and join some meetups, right, Henri? And Henri runs a really, really fantastic meetup, Jamstack focus meetup it's technically Toronto and Chicago, and now I think he's going worldwide at some point. now that meetups are virtual, it's like, well, wherever. It's everywhere and anywhere. But he does really, really great ones. So he has a lot of fun ones. He put the link there. I highly recommend that. There's a ton of different meetups like as well, Jamstack San Francisco, Jamstack New York City, that are running lots of great content around that too.
Awesome. Henri, hit me up. Maybe we can bring you in into Mintbean and do something together.
Yeah, Henri's a great speaker too, so I highly recommend bringing him in for
Awesome.
that.
Will do. This was a fantastic workshop. Really appreciate it, Brian.
You're welcome.
I learned a lot. I didn't know much about Jamstack. I'm not a developer these days, but it's always nice to know how the ecosystem is supported and how everything is working.
Great. Well, I'm glad. Hopefully it was helpful to everybody, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. All right, guys. Happy Monday and happy Easter Monday. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of Monday. Take care. Bye.